for more on the summit. I'm joined here in the studio by our international affairs editor, Philip Turle. Hello, Philip. Philip, tell us more about what's on the agenda for this summit.
Well, first of all, Alison, there has been a general feeling amongst African leaders that the United States has sort of turned their back on Africa over the past few years. Remember these very derogatory remarks made by the former President Donald Trump towards African nations. There was even a comment by George W. Bush at one time that Africa, who referred to Africa as a country. So there is a feeling that the US has never really taken Africa very seriously. It's not part of their priorities. Donald Trump never visited Africa. Joe Biden hasn't been there so far since he was elected. So I think this is a way of the United States trying to show that it is interested and it wants to reboot the situation after an 8-year gap since the last conference of this sort, which was held under the previous president, Barack Obama. So I think also part of this is a feeling in the US that Africa is a continent that is always aligned with humanitarian needs, with war, with terrorism, and that the United States has more pressing issues elsewhere. So this time round, the challenges and the main issues being discussed concern good governance, food security, global health, and the climate crisis, as we've seen in the past few hours with this terrible collapse of roads in the Democratic Republic of Congo due to flooding. Those are the main issues on the agenda. But there's also something else, which is the US are going to hand over at least $55 billion worth of aid to Africa over the next 3 years. And President Biden has made it clear that what he would like to do is to ask for at least one African nation to be present on the UN Security Council, because none are there at the moment, and also for the African Union to be represented as part of the G20, the world's top economic countries, because that is also absent, and saying that it's basically not realistic for a continent where there are 1.2 billion people not to be represented on either of those two world bodies.
And as you pointed out, Philip, the U.S. has seen a gradual erosion of its influence in Africa, particularly in the face of China and more recently Russia. Is it possible at this point for the U.S. to reverse that situation?
It's I think, difficult for the US to reverse it, but the US doesn't want to let it take the advantage anymore over US investment in Africa. First of all, concerning Russia, Joe Biden has accused the Russians of meddling in many African countries by providing them with cheap weapons and also with mercenaries. We've seen that in Mali, more recently Mali, which has cut its ties with France. As far as China is concerned, there is a willingness, I think, of the US to increase its investments in China. If you look at the figures over the last few years, back in 2014, the US was up to $150 billion investment in China. That's gone down to about $64 billion now, whereas the other way round, you have China, which back in 2014 had $160 billion worth of investment. Now it's $254 billion worth of investment, so much greater. And I think the US would like to inverse that. And one of the key reasons is that Africa, which, as I said, has 1.2 billion people, is also mostly young people. They're mostly young people. The average age of an African is 19, for example. It's 38 in the United States and 45 in Europe. So the US sees this as a tremendous potential for US future investment in Africa. It's not just a question of taking away African minerals and human resources, but also to invest in the African continent to make those young people commercial investors in the future and also potential customers for US goods. And I think that is something the US would like to try to get off the ground. This is really a mindset shift in the US relationship with Africa, which is being formulated at this summit, which is taking place in Washington.
It's going to be interesting to see what comes out of it. Philip, as always, thank you for your analysis. That's France 24's international affairs editor, Philip Turle.